Hey, welcome to our second edition of 15-Minute Fridays, where we're taking 15 minutes to cover a specific topic related to turfgrass agronomics. Last week, if you're with us, we talked about winter weed cleanup options, where we discussed the differences in annual bluegrass control between products that provide speed versus long-term efficacy, products that produce speed versus turfgrass safety, and then also tied in resistance management as related to herbicide use and mode of actions as well. We also discussed broadleaf control considerations for winter weed cleanup, amines versus ester formulations. And then finally, we briefly discussed adjuvant selection. And so I encourage you to go back in the playlist, listen to last week's episode. If you weren't able to catch us, there's a lot of good information that is still pertinent as we move into growing season. But this week, we're moving on to pre-emergent herbicides. And as a quick definition, a pre-emergent herbicide is an applied material which prevents weeds from establishing. So that can be any numbers of material. We'll talk about a lot of them as we go through. But how do pre-emergent herbicides work? Whether they're spray applied, whether they're applied on granular fertilizer, all of them act in a very similar way. So as a general rule, look here at my cartoon here, and I'm not an artist by any means, so bear with me, but you have your soil, which is indicated by the brown. You have your turf grass, which is indicated by the green triangles here. And then you have these little black dots. Imagine these as weed seeds in the soil. These are the seeds, maybe crabgrass, maybe goosegrass, that as we go through the season will disrupt and germinate and give you a non-uniform turf stand. But when you apply a pre-emergent herbicide, whether it's spray applied or through a granule, what's actually occurring after you run irrigation or after you have rainfall is that the pre-emergent herbicide acts as a barrier which will inhibit the germination or establishment of those weed seeds so they never become problematic and never become visible. Now, there's a lot of pre-emergent herbicides on the market. These are a lot of the common turfgrass pre-emergent herbicides that are listed here: prodiamine or barricade, dithiopyr, dimension, two popular options that are applied in the spring to prevent crabgrass establishment going into the growing season. Pendulum or pendimethalin. Echelon is a combination product of prodiamine and sulfentrazone. Gallery or isoxaben, it's a excellent pre-emergent herbicide, but it's more effective on broadleafs than it is on grassy weeds, and specifically on crabgrass or goosegrass. Ronstar oxadiazone is an excellent pre-emergent herbicide that's effective on grassy weeds, but tends to be a little bit more effective on goosegrass than it is on crabgrass. Spectacle or indaziflam, it is a highly active pre-emergent herbicide. It has great activity on goosegrass, has great activity on crabgrass, has good activity on broadleaf weeds. So it's a very well-rounded pre-emergent herbicide in that sense, but it can't be applied to as many different types of turf grass as some of these others, such as barricade, dimension, pendulum, etc. And then tower, dimethenamide P. It's nice. It's a unique mode of action. We talked a little bit about modes of action last week, but the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee, or HRAC, they have a list of codes which designate what the mode of action is of a specific product or a specific active ingredient. And you'll see that dimethenamide P in tower has a HRAC code of 15, which is different than the others. 3, you see a lot of 3s in there. You see a couple of 14s and a 29. But the downside of tower is the relative longevity to some of these other materials, specifically compared to spectacle or barricade. And we'll get more into that here in a moment. That is important to note as far as the longevity of materials, because all these things are not all the same longevity. You can't just apply them in March or April or whenever your application timing is and expect them all to last the same length of time. And one characteristic that's specifically related to is what we call the persistence or the half-life in days. So if you take a material, just using rough numbers here, if you take a material and apply 1 pound of product per 1,000 square feet, how long does it take for soil microbial activity or some other degradation process to reduce that amount in half? So go from 1 pound per 1,000 square feet to half a pound per 1,000 square feet. And what you'll notice is that this half-life is different depending on the active ingredient. So barricade, which is thought of as having a relatively long persistence in soil, has a half-life of 70 to 120 days. Dimension or dithiopyr has a half-life of 17 days, so much shorter. Now, that's not to say that dimension is only going to last 17 days. That's not the case at all. But just as a general comparison with prodiamine, dithiopyr is going to last a shorter amount of time because of its shorter half-life than prodiamine. Indaziflam is thought of as a very long-lasting pre-emergent herbicide, which follows in suit with its long half-life of greater than 150 days. And you also notice that as you go through here and you start to look at individual active ingredients, that a lot of them have a range. So barricades 70 to 120 days. And that's because it's not a static measure. It has to do with soil moisture. It can do with soil texture. It can do with soil microbial activity. There's a lot of factors that go into this persistence, but it gives you a good idea, general idea of the relative ranking of how long these materials will last in the soil. So how are pre-emergent herbicides applied? We already talked about spray applications. It's likely the most common way that pre-emergent herbicide applications are applied. If you are making spray applications, it's vitally important that you have complete coverage of the treatment area. So whether you're applying with a 8-nozzle boom or you're applying with a single nozzle spray gun, whatever the application method with the spray, it's important that you have good, even, consistent coverage across the entire application area. A second common way is to apply as an active ingredient sparged onto a fertilizer blend. So look here at my cartoon. This green blob is representative of an individual single fertilizer prill. During the manufacturing process, if a customer so wishes, we can coat the fertilizer prill through a sparging process with a pre-emergent herbicide. So same fertilizer prill here on the green, but now through the manufacturing process, we have coated that fertilizer prill with a pre-emergent herbicide, which is indicated by the yellow circle around the fertilizer prill. So once applied, after irrigation, the active ingredient comes off of the fertilizer prill and it goes into the soil and has the same pre-emergence activity as you would with the spray applied material. And so through Harrell's, you have a lot of different options for sparged materials on fertilizer, and anything that's highlighted here in green is available to be sparged on fertilizer through Harrell. So Barricade, Dimension, Ronstar, Pendulum, Echelon, a lot of your common grassy weed pre-emergent herbicides that are typically applied this time of year. If you don't have the labor, we're in an extremely tight labor environment currently. So if you don't have the labor to apply it through a spray application, consider applying a sparge fertilizer. You can take care of fertilization and you can take care of your pre-emergent herbicide applications all with a single application, which is going to enhance the efficiency of your labor. Now, when you look at a product, how do you tell the difference between a non-sparged and sparged blend? Let's say you open up a bag of fertilizer and you're not sure which is which, or you have different materials in the back of your truck or in the back of your rig. Maybe you're saying, hey, which material am I going to apply here? Well, you can generally tell, especially with the Barricade fertilizers. This isn't true for all fertilizers. Some of them have a little bit different color. But the non-sparged, you're going to see a color difference between the non-sparged and the Barricade sparged. You just kind of see a yellowish hue, if you will, with the Barricade. And that's the nature of the active ingredient. So you're looking at Polyon 4400 on the left, non-sparged, and then on the right, it's a blended fertilizer. There's some other materials in there, but the dark green prills, those are actually Polyon 4400. They've just been coated with the yellow Barricade, giving it a little bit different color, a little bit different hue. The second, I don't have a photograph of it here, excuse me, but if you're purchasing the product from Harrell's, if it comes in a white bag, it's going to be a non-sparged material. If it comes in a yellow bag, then it will be a sparged material. So a yellow bag will have some sort of an active ingredient attached to the fertilizer prill. But it's not just as simple with sparge fertilizers as making an application. You have to apply the right amount of material per acre. And so every sparge fertilizer granule that you apply have what we call a zone of influence. And if you think about it on a single fertilizer prill basis, again, you make an application, the active ingredient comes off of the prill, and it's going to have a pre-emergent activity on a very small amount of area around that single prill. And so if you don't have a high enough density, if you don't have a high enough application rate per thousand or per acre, then potentially you can have gaps in the pre-emergent coverage with that low application rate. That's indicated by the photograph or the image that you're looking at here on your screen, is that you have a low density of application rate, you have individual fertilizer prills, and the zones of influence of the pre-emergent activity of those individual fertilizer prills don't overlap, and there's gaps in between each fertilizer prill. So this could result in perhaps crabgrass escapes or goosegrass escapes and not having good, effective pre-emergent activity. As an alternative, if you apply at a high enough rate, now we have a much higher density of prills per 1,000 square feet or prills per acre, and you have overlap in the zones of influence. And now you have a good, thorough coverage, and there's nowhere for a goosegrass plant to germinate or a crabgrass plant to germinate and break through the pre-emergent barrier. So it's important to understand that you're applying the right active ingredient that's also being applied at the right application rate. So you might be saying, well, hey, what is the right application rate? And so there's no real right or wrong answer that's a hard and fast truth, but there's a rule of thumb that you can go off of for many applications. So these are smaller particle size fertilizer granules, SGN 120 or so in that ballpark. You want to be at an absolute minimum of 150 pounds per acre. If you can apply 200 pounds per acre, that's great. It's going to perform that much better. But as an absolute minimum, 150 pounds per acre. If you're using a regular size granule, which is more common for lawn care applications, more common for rough applications, 220 SGN and above, you want to be at a minimum of 200 pounds per acre. Now, if you can get up to 225, 250, 275, the higher the better, because you're just going to have that much more density, that many more particles per square foot, and that better overlap of those individual zones of influence for each individual fertilizer prill. So to wrap up, a few pre-emergent herbicides, BMPs. If you're talking about spray applied fertilizer, or excuse me, spray applied pre-emergences, you want to ensure that you have complete, adequate coverage across the entire treatment area. And then to activate the active ingredient, it's important that you either have irrigation or rainfall within a couple of days of application. And with granular applications, similar rules apply. Irrigate following application, ensure that you have complete coverage, and then apply with an adequate spread rate. I can't stress that enough. If you don't have an adequate spread rate with granular applied materials, you're not going to have good, complete coverage. And if you want some more information on that to make sure that your fertilizer blend is being applied at the right rate, I encourage you to get with your Harold's rep, because they're a resource of information for all things related to both spray and granular applied pre-emergence herbicides. So that's all we have for this week. In 2 weeks, we'll switch gears. We're going to talk about soil testing and why there are so many options for soil testing and what information you can expect to learn.